Hello and welcome to this second video looking at a student's essay on bayonet charge and remains. In that first video I showed you why this part of the introduction is excellent and the other part doesn't score you any mark. I showed you how not to write about context when you're writing about a poem, and I reminded you of why BOOSE is such a good way to structure your essay comparing the poems. And I showed you the next paragraph, which taught you how to write brilliantly about the context when you're comparing the poems. So now let's look at how to analyze the language of the poems to get the highest mark. A similar idea that these poems explore is the soldier's blind following. In Bayonet Charge, later BC, so notice how she makes her writing easier in the exam. She's not going to keep writing Bayonet Charge all the time. She'll just call it BC. The soldier is described to have suddenly awoke. A lovely embedded quotation. This image is curious as he is depicted running. Here, Hughes is trying to show, so linking straight to the poet's purpose, that's what's going to get it the marks. Hughes is trying to show the man finally becoming awake in his reasoning of why he is blindly running towards a hedge. We can later see this as he starts to question, was he the hand pointing that second, which shows that he has doubts about what he's doing. So this would have been even better had she named this as a metaphor, but she still gets marks even without naming it as a metaphor, and even better, has doubts about his involvement in the war is much more specific than what he's doing. That's a bit general, but it's a well-structured comparison. It begins with the connective or discourse marker, a similar idea, and she links both poems together. So she's showing some really good skills and getting good marks. Her next paragraph is even better. In Remains, later R, again to save her time, the protagonist goes through a journey. At first, he states that he, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. This creates an image of blind obedience and strips the soldiers of their identity. So this sentence here is the poet's purpose, and she has given us two purposes here, to show their blind obedience and to strip the soldiers of their identity. Similarly to BC, the soldier questions his intentions, later proffering his bloody life in my bloody hands. This reference to Shakespeare's Macbeth shows his guilt about the needless murder he committed. And so here we have, again, two parts to the explanation. That's one, and this is two. The soldier questions his intentions. And you remember that this was one purpose here, creating blind obedience, and this was the second purpose, stripping the soldier of their identity. So what makes this paragraph so skillful is that the student has inferred two poets' purposes for each poem here. So that's four poets' purposes in one paragraph. This is the most highly skilled one in the essay, probably, because of that. Now she has a second language feature, and again is saying it's a similarity. Another similarity is the graphic description of warfare. In BC, the personification of bullets smacking the belly out of the air is used to show how violent war is. So that is the first author's purpose. Armitage does the same thing when he explains that one of his mates tossed his guts back into his body. The two quotations show the disregard for pain the poets are expressing. So that is a second purpose, and the pain felt by the soldiers and others. That, if you like, is a third purpose. So you can see how continually linking to poets' purposes gets you into the top marks. If we go back to my mnemonic, BOOSE, she's written about the beginnings of the poems, and she's just written about the two language feature comparisons, which were the O's. So she's using that part of my technique, even though I didn't teach her. She's already written about the structure, and you followed that other video, I hope. Now, to make it a perfect answer, she really needs to write about the ending, because in the ending, the poet's viewpoint always changes, or the character in the poem always changes. And if we go back to that penultimate paragraph, you'll see that she has kind of signposted to the examiner that there is this change. The protagonist goes through a journey, so that implies that there's a change at the end. Um, and the change in remains is that the character now feels guilt, whereas earlier in the poem, um, he felt no guilt at all. He was just tossing the guts back into the body. This allusion to Macbeth is a really good one to spot, and that's a grade 9 technique, or at least a grade 8 technique. If you can make a comparison to another text, which you can reasonably expect the examiner to know, then you will get excellent marks. Um, so you would expect any English examiner to know about Macbeth. They would be less likely to know about, I don't know, the Twilight Saga. So you're not putting in any comparison. And of course, the other thing is it has to be a text which you know the poet would have read, or the author of any other text that you're analysing would have read. But that use of allusion is a really good way to get into the top mark. And in this final paragraph of the argument, she would have been even better had she shown a similar journey in Bayonet Charge, but she doesn't fully do that. Now, let's look at the conclusion and see how she does there. Okay, to conclude, I believe that Hughes and Armitage have used different techniques and language to display, now here comes the author's purpose, the poet's purpose, a unified outrage at the effects of war. Excellent. Uh, Now, what's going to make this an even better conclusion is there are more purposes. Their disregard for obedience is itself shown by the patriotic tear shared ironically, or the blood shadow of the looter. Really skillful to include two quotations, one from each poem, in your conclusion, a really high order skill, which reflect the message that the two poets view warfare as. So here is the next viewpoint of the poet's purpose, and you'll see from my three different colours that she has given three different purposes. One, that to say warfare is violent, two, to say warfare is painful, and three, to argue that war is therefore unnecessary. So hopefully you can see why this has got 28 out of 30 marks, despite having quite a few weaknesses in it. It is 571 words long, something that you yourself probably could write in 40 minutes. And if you can't, you need to practice the speed of your writing. And the only way to practice it is to try practice essays. There is not a shortcut, ladies and gentlemen, but once you commit, you will find that you learn really, really quickly. Okay, let's have a quick summary of, So there were 6 things to learn from this essay. 1, the introduction is too wordy and vague in places, but where you are specific, you get the marks. The candidate hasn't analysed the endings of the poems to show the change in perspective or poet's viewpoint. She's only done that with one poem a little bit. BOOSE would have helped this candidate, so learn BOOSE, watch my videos on BOOTSE, which has been shortened to BOOSE, to help you. The first structural point on bayonet charge is overdone, an example of what I mean by stretching it too far. The second one on remains is properly linked to meaning and our understanding of the speaker. So when you write about structure and you make it relate to our understanding of the speaker or the meaning of the poem, you will get the marks. I've shown you how she uses a brilliant analysis of language linked to more than one purpose for each poet. That's what made this better than good, okay? Good answers would just have one poet's purpose. She had several. And then finally, a conclusion which links to more than one purpose of the poet and includes a quotation from each poem. Well done. You can do more with your conclusion. Watch my other videos on how to write a conclusion if you want to find out how to get 30 marks out of 30. So once again, thank you very much for watching. If you would like more, don't forget to subscribe.